Welcome to the Pauper 1%ers, a guide to the Pauper decks that make up only 1% or less of the metagame. I already made a video going over the more prominent decks in Pauper as well as discussing the format overall, so if you haven't seen it, I recommend watching it first. In that video, I decided I wouldn't include any of the 1% decks, but where precisely that line isn't an exact science, and data from different sources conflict with each other, so some of the fringier decks may have been a little more or less represented than I thought. It turns out there are a lot of other decks I didn't cover, and some people in the comments were somewhat disappointed that their favorite pet decks were left out. So I guess I've got to make it up to all three of you guys and cover the remaining lists. Many cards in Pauper tend to crop up in multiple decks, and many decks look quite similar, meaning some could be mistaken for others or overlap significantly, but I've done my best to investigate and pick out the format's buried treasures. That is to say, I'm pretty confident this video will cover all the remaining decks in the format until it's published and the comments inform me of the ones I missed. Since all of these decks are around 1% or less of the metagame, I'll be going through them roughly in alphabetical order. You can use the timestamps to skip to specific sections if you prefer. Tron. Tron differentiates itself from the traditional Ephemerate style Tron decks by being a pure combo deck rather than being based on value plays. The idea is to use Ashnod's Altar to generate a ton of mana by sacrificing artifacts and eventually set up infinite loops to win. Many of the cards in the deck are good sacrifice spotters, such as Ichor Wellspring and Chromatic Star, and other cards in the deck are good sack outlets as well, like the off-play Deadly Dispute and Reckoner's Bargain. Eventually, you'll get 2 Myr Retrievers, which begins the loop. Sacrifice Myr Retriever number 1 to Ashnod's Altar, making 2 mana. Using that mana, cast Myr Retriever number 2. Sacrifice it, making 2 mana and getting back the first one. This can be repeated infinitely, which, while it doesn't net mana, does continuously trigger anything that triggers from casting, entering, or sacrificing artifacts or creatures. The preferred outlet is Golem Foundry, but anything that satisfies the trigger conditions is potentially viable. Since Golem Foundry will get infinite counters, you can make infinite golems. If that's not enough to win, you can sacrifice golems for infinite mana and dig through your deck until you find makeshift munitions, which can then sack the golems for infinite damage. Boros Synthesizer. Boros Synthesizer is a low-to-the-ground aggro deck that, at first glance, looks similar to Boros Bully. The main difference here is that the deck is looking to use Experimental Synthesizer as a card advantage engine in combination with Glinthawk and Core Skyfisher to pick it back up for value. There are also usually other artifacts to recoup for advantage, such as Ichor Wellspring or Spare Supplies. The rest of the deck is a fairly typical aggro deck, utilizing burn spells and aggressive prowess creatures that work well with the pick 'em back up and play 'em again plan. The deck also sometimes splashes into black, primarily for Deadly Dispute and Chainer's Edict. Cascade, commonly Jund Cascade, is a mid-range value deck that uses Cascade cards to accrue resource advantages. If you're unfamiliar with Pauper and only know Cascade decks from Modern, this deck isn't like those. Modern Cascade decks are all centered around cascading into a specific, high payoff spell such as Crashing Footfalls or Living End. Those cards, and any equivalent to them, don't exist in Pauper, so the deck has to be built instead around accruing value by hitting something good at random from the Cascade effect. Now technically, there are many Cascade spells legal in Pauper, but most of them aren't good. The good ones are those from Commander Legends, namely Boarding Party and Annoyed Altasaur, and at 6 and 7 mana, the deck has to be tailored to surviving long enough to get to them. You don't want to play ramp cards like Arbor Elf because they're terrible Cascade hits, so instead, all the cards in the deck are either value creatures of some kind or removal spells to survive the early game. Except for Cleansing Wildfire, which can be primarily used as a ramp spell by targeting your own indestructible lands, but which also has some other uses such as hitting enemy Basilisk Gates or Tron lands. Cleric Footing, or just Clerics, and Tireless Tribe combo. I'm grouping these decks together because they're running similar game plans even if they're technically different. First, let's go over Clerics. Cleric Footing, or just Clerics, is a white aggro deck that involves pumping the toughness of cheap creatures and then granting them the ability to deal damage via their toughness. Daru Spiritualist and Task Force pump toughness when targeted, so, using any spells or abilities that target, but primarily Nomad's Encore since it can target creatures infinitely, pump your clerics to massive toughness and then enchant one with Solid Footing, an aura that makes the creature assign damage via its toughness, which is where the footing part of Cleric Footing comes from. After that, either smack in over and over or use something like Wedding Invitation to make the creature unblockable. The rest of the deck mostly makes use of small, middling white creatures to fill up its ranks, and a few other effects like Benevolent Bodyguard as protection and Heliod's Pilgrim to find footing. Tireless Tribe is a creature that gains +4 toughness by discarding a card. The plan is to discard multiple cards and then use a power toughness inverting spell like Inside Out or About Face to make Tribe lethal. Since you have to discard cards to Tribe, the deck runs things that help mitigate that card disadvantage such as Squadron Hawk and Sacred Cat. The deck expands into blue for cantrips, card draw spells, and other things such as Circular Logic, which works well with Tribe as a discard outlet due to Madness. Like the Gates decks, this deck also uses Basilisk Gate as a payoff for any of its creatures, not just Tribe, and can use spells like Shadow Rift to force a lethal attack past blockers. Protection spells are also important since you have to expend a lot of resources on Tribe, so you don't want to make a lethal attack only to be blown out by removal. Elves. Like its Modern and Legacy counterparts, Elves is somewhat of a combo deck, spewing out Elves and trying to make tons of mana with Priest of Titania, Mana Making All-Star, and Quirion Ranger, Untapping Machine. Birchlore Rangers also does a poor man's imitation of Heritage Druid and is good with Nettle Sentinel. Since Pauper doesn't get access to the big payoffs like Natural Order or Azuri, Pauper Elves is more combat focused and uses things like Lizalana Huntmaster to go wide and Timberwatch Elf to greatly pump a single creature. Winding Way and Lead the Stampede are the card advantage engines, and the deck can pay for blue cards like Distant Melody to draw cards via elves that make non-green mana like Birchlore Rangers. Well-Wisher is a huge pain for opposing aggro decks to overcome, especially in combination with Quirion Ranger untapping it. And as usual, Quirion Ranger is great with any tappable elves like Priest of Titania and Timberwatch Elf. Infect. If you're familiar with Infect in Modern or Legacy, Pauper Infect is the same idea. Play cheap creatures with Infect and pump them to lethal damage. Glistener Elf and Blighted Agent are the old standbys, but without Inkmoth Nexus, the deck is forced to play alternative Infectors such as Blight Mamba and or Ichorclaw Myrrh. The remaining deck is as expected, mostly pump spells including Embiggen, Might of Old Krosa, Mutagenic Growth, Rancor, and Seal of Strength, and protective spells like Snakeskin Veil, Vines of Vastwood, and Apostle's Blessing. Initiative. Initiative is a deck that generates value exclusively via cards that grant the initiative, but that's not the whole story since many decks in Pauper also play initiative cards. As a reminder, Initiative ventures into Undercity immediately when you play an initiative card at the beginning of your upkeep, and when you retake the initiative from your opponent. Certain cards grant the initiative when you play them, which can only be lost by the opponent successfully attacking you or playing their own initiative card. In the case of the initiative deck specifically, it's all in on the initiative mechanic and plays as many copies as possible of the few initiative cards legal in Pauper, those being Avenging Hunter, Goliath Paladin, and Trailblazer's Torch. But since all three of those cards cost between 4 and 5 mana, almost the entire rest of the deck is built to ramp into them as fast as possible with the black and colorless fast mana spells. Lotus Petal and Dark Ritual are the solo acts, with the remaining cards needing creatures to synergize with. Ornithopter and Shambling Ghast enable the best fast mana spell Culling the Weak, along with Springleaf Drum and Deadly Dispute, which can also sacrifice artifacts. Aside from all that, the deck will play a few other cards like Snuff Out for removal and Unexpected Fangs, which permanently lifelinks one of the big initiative creatures similar to the blue-black fish deck. As a reminder, here are the beneficial effects of Undercity, usually going down the rooms on the left-hand side of the dungeon. So, an ideal sequence gets an initiative card into play by turn 1 or 2, which can involve various combinations of petals, rituals, small creatures, and or Springleaf Drum, and then snowballs from there. Kiln Fiend. Kiln Fiend is an aggro and pseudo combo deck that uses creatures that get massively pumped when you cast spells, specifically Kiln Fiend and its lesser cousin Festival Crasher. With one or more Fiends or Crashers in play, you can cast multiple cheap spells and pump their power tremendously to attack for lethal. If getting through blockers is an issue, numerous of the spells grant trample or unblockability, including Ancestral Anger, Crash Through, Apostle's Blessing, and Temur Battle Rage. Unlike Infect and other decks that want to pump their creatures, Fiend and Crasher inherently grow bigger no matter what spell you cast, so the priority is on effects that either help get through blockers, spells that are free like Mutagenic Growth and Flashback Lava Dart, and spells that replace themselves like Ancestral Anger and Monomorphose. Mono Black Control / Devotion. Mono Black Control, aka Mono Black Devotion, is a black deck that primarily uses a combination of various value creatures and removal spells to outgrind the opponent. No specific cards are necessary since the deck basically just wants to play whatever the best black creatures and black spells are at any given moment, but some time-tested favorites include Kuumbaj Witches as a way to repeatedly pick off small creatures, Chittering Rats and similar cards to 2-for-1 the opponent, Grey Merchant and Vampire Sovereign as big life swing effects, Gurmag Angler for big beats, Monarch cards like Thorn of the Black Rose for long-term value, and a smorgasbord of black removal and value spells like Chainer's Edict, Cast Down, and Sign in Blood. Mono Green Aggro. Mono Green Aggro is the answer to the question, what would you get if you built Infect with no Infect creatures? It's a small and swarmy aggro deck that uses various 1 and 2 drop creatures along with pump effects like Hunger of the Howlpack, Savage Swipe, and Elephant Guide. Other than that, there's not much to say. What you see is what you get. Mono White Heroic. Mono White Heroic follows in the same tradition of various Pauper decks involving pumping a single creature, in this case to large +1 counter-based heights with cheap self-improvement spells. Laguna Band Trailblazer and Akroan Skyguard are the heroic beaters, although other creatures can be used like Vault Scourge since it has lifelink, and Deathblade Elite as quasi-removal since it provokes enemy creatures. Besides the creatures, the deck looks sort of like Boggles since it's filled with various auras and one-off pump effects, although unlike Boggles, the creatures aren't inherently protected, so it needs to play defensive spells like Karametra's Blessing and emerge unscathed. Pestilence. Pestilence is a value deck built around the enchantment Pestilence, a 4-mana enchantment for which you can pay a single black mana to deal 1 damage to each creature and each player. However, you have to sacrifice it if there are no creatures in play. So, the idea is to control the board by pinging down opposing creatures until either they're all gone or the only ones left are too weak to hurt you while maintaining your own creatures. Other removal spells like Cast Down and Chainer's Edict deal with creatures too big for Pestilence to handle. Because Pestilence also damages both players, you can't use it indefinitely and need your own creatures to deal damage to the opponent. However, if your opponent is at a lower life total than you, repeatedly activating Pestilence can be a way to close out the game. Pestilence decks are primarily white-black, although they can be built as mono-black or other black-based color combinations. The cards played and their interactions are mostly what you already see in other value-based mid-range decks in the format, including commonly played cards like Thraben Inspector and Core Skyfisher. Ponza. Ponza is a red-green ramp/land destruction deck that looks to ramp with Wild Growth, Utopia Sprawl, and Arbor Elf into the land destruction spells Thermokarst and Moonvolley Acid Moss, before reaching the bigger beater creatures Avenging Hunter, Boarding Party, and Annoyed Altasaur. It shares similarities with other Initiative and Cascade-based decks, but is more focused on early disruption via land destruction. It also plays 3 drops like Llanowar Visionary and Jewel Thief to help bridge the gap from the early turns to the more expensive payoffs, and they're good plays on turn 2 off a turn 1 ramp spell if you don't have Thermokarst. Rakdos Madness. Rakdos Madness is basically a black-red burn deck that uses a few synergies between discard outlets and Madness cards, specifically outlets like Scrapwork Mutt, Faithless Looting, and cards that make blood tokens, and Madness payoffs such as Kitchen Imp, Fiery Temper, and Alms of the Vein. There are more mid-rangier black and red Madness cards available in Pauper, but it seems like they're mostly not very good, and so the archetype adopted a more aggressive burn plan instead. Reanimator. Reanimator is a black-red combo-esque deck where you cheat out big creatures in the early game. Some choice bombs are Eldrazi Devastator, Ulamog's Crusher, and Rust Goliath. Cards like Faithless Looting, Cathartic Reunion, and Tormenting Voice help bin the creatures from your hand and dig for necessary cards. Any of the big creatures can then be reanimated with Exhume. Lotus Petal provides additional speed. Haste can be granted via Dragon's Breath, which will return from the graveyard attached to any of the big creatures you reanimate, or by Bitter Reunion, which doubles as a rummaging card. Slivers. Slivers is a go-wide aggro deck built around the Slivers tribe. Every creature in the deck is some kind of lord that either pumps the team or grants another useful ability. Overlapping cards with stat-boosting effects are Muscle Sliver, Predatory Sliver, and Sinew Sliver, but there are also other lesser abilities like Plated Sliver and Sidewinder Sliver. Gemhide Sliver acts as ramp. Like Elves, the deck plays Winding Way and Lead the Stampede to accelerate or recoup resources. Sliver decks are primarily green-white, but they can also branch into other colors, usually red for things like Hunter Sliver or blue for Winged Sliver. Keep in mind that older slivers have different templating than newer ones and grant their bonuses to every sliver on the battlefield, including enemy ones, which could be relevant if you happen to play against the world's one other slivers player. Tortured Existence. Tortured Existence is a usually Abzan-colored value deck built around the enchantment Tortured Existence, for which you can pay a single black mana and discard a creature to return another creature from your graveyard to your hand. The deck is filled with self-mill effects like Dredgers, Satyr Wayfinder, and Commune with the Gods to fill up the graveyard and give you card selections on which creatures you want. This essentially does 3 things. First, it means that every creature in your deck can always be exchanged for the best creature in your graveyard. Second, you can combine Tortured Existence with creatures that skirt its cost or are always payable. For example, Golgari Brownscale can be dredged so you always have a creature to discard, and Pit Keeper recoups a creature. And third, you can also play many Silver Bullet creatures and repeatedly recur them, such as Spore Frog to infinitely fog the opponent, or Benelish Sleeper or Crypt Rats to continuously remove enemy creatures. Aside from its core strategy, the deck plays a few common effects found in other decks like Journey to Nowhere for removal and Basilisk Gate. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the Pauper 1%ers. Thank you to my supporters, and if you enjoy these videos, consider supporting the channel, and take care.